environments and in the way we communicate and operate on a day-to-day basis. Our first keynote speaker is among the first media scholars who conceptualized and illuminated this change. He is usually introduced as one of the three leading scholars in this novel approach to the relationship between media and society. And if you have heard about mediatization, then you must have also heard about him, because he's at the forefront of it. He's a professor of media studies at the Department of Media, Cognition and Communication at the University of Copenhagen. He is the chief editor of the journals Northern Lights and Journal Media, Cognition and Communication. His recent books in English include Mediatization and Religion, Nordic Perspectives, The Mediatization of Culture and Society, and the Dynamics of Mediatized Conflicts. Today, he will talk to us about the dynamics of conflicts in the mediatized world. I'm grateful and truly delighted that he has accepted our call. Dear colleagues, please help me welcoming Professor Stig Hjarvard.
Thank you very much for this warm welcome, and I'm very happy to be here. It's my first time in Banja, Luka, so I'm very pleased to be here. It's an experience, and thank you for an interesting lecture this morning, giving a very wide view on communication theory and its history. As you say, what I'm going to talk about here is about dynamics of conflicts on the basis of what I call mediatization theory, or what has gradually established itself as mediatization theory. Maybe I should start with a little note upon sort of, where I come from. My point of departure is media studies, in particular sociology of media. So I'm not, in a sense, a communication scholar per se. I'm sort of more interested in the way in which various forms of media technologies, but also media as institutions, work and come to structure, influence themselves, be influenced by social and cultural affairs. And maybe on a more personal note, I was asked this morning in an email from an editor who's writing a communication scholar book, where he asked various people who have sort of been involved in formulating theories, could you give a 75-word explanation of why you, on a personal basis, have found that theory interesting to develop? And that puzzled me all this morning, actually. Sort of, if I boil it, could I do a 75-word explanation of that? But maybe if I should give it a more personal feeling, that my kids were born in the late 80s and grew up in the 90s and the subsequent decade, and now they're in the late 20s and early 30s. And what I experienced from their early childhood was that their communicative environment became different than the one that I lived in when I was a child. So they were, in a sense, born with computers, also because their father was fond of computers, but they were born with computers. They got cell phones, they got satellite television, they got the internet, they're now on social media. And as I sort of matured as a scholar, I increasingly thought that media were not just new ways of communicating with one another, they are also, in a sense, social tools that creates an environment through which actually social and cultural affairs are also changed. So the short 75-word version of why this may be interesting is that it gives a kind of general sociological framework for understanding why media matters, and not least why they are implicated in social and cultural change and come to condition but not determine the way in which we interact with each other. So that was the short version. Now you'll have the long version, the tedious version, perhaps not so interesting or at least entertaining version. Now, I'm going to do a double switch here because I have two screens to operate with. Another example of mediatization of scholarship here. What I'm going to talk about here are, in a sense, three arguments and one example or illustration. I'll start by sort of giving you a general idea about what is actually meant by the idea of mediatization, that is, that media are implicated in cultural and social change, and how media come to condition and determine social interaction. And for the last part, that is about the conditioning, I'll try to explicate that by saying that media increasingly are present in various social environments, to different degrees, of course, but they are present, and thereby they come to insert various dynamics into social interaction. They insert dynamics, but the outcome of social interaction by and through these dynamics are extremely diverse. So the argument is not that the media, in a sense, have the power to persuade, to structure interaction in particular ways, that is, serving particular ends. It's rather that they, in a sense, initially condition the way in which we actually orient ourselves and use various communicative tools for interaction with each other. And I'll try to use one example of a social conflict, cultural conflict, also a religious conflict of a major size that may be known to most people, namely the attack of the French satirical magazine Charlie Hebdo earlier on. Now, to my argument, I'll just see what, if I'm synchronizing my slides here. Now, mediatization, first and foremost, it's an ugly word. No one really needs such an ugly word, apart from the fact that you also need to theorize how media are part of a structuration process. Now, as I see it, mediatization is useful from various points of view. You may consider mediatization a kind of research agenda. That is, it's a kind of an opportunity to a renewed study of the influence of media in various domains of modern society. As such, it's a kind of sort of looking back at some of the initial questions that put the field of media and communication studies together in the first place, but may, in a sense, along the way, have sort of slipped out, not become that important at some point. As I see the field of media and communication research, it has become diversified, to some extent fragmented into various subdisciplines in which there is not really that much sort of coherent ideas about what is the common agenda. And mediatization is an attempt not to try to make one major agenda, but rather to address some particular issues that seem to be important for the field as a whole. Furthermore, you can see it as a kind of theoretical challenge to move beyond some of the existing paradigms. One paradigm being the traditional sort of effect paradigm, that is, that media are instruments of persuasion, not least, that they can do something to people, persuading them, perhaps even changing their behavior, the so-called what media do to the audience paradigm. But it's also another take to the influence of media than the traditional alternative version, that is the empowered active audience paradigm, often labeled what audiences do with the media. In a sense, mediatization is a third approach or a third paradigm compared to these paradigms. I'm not saying that the effect paradigm or the active audience paradigms are obsolete. I think they still have some very important and valid ideas to bring to the table. I'm just saying that some of the assumptions here are not sufficient for understanding the way in which media are implicated in cultural and social change. And why is that? I think one major problem of existing paradigm is that they, in a sense, consider media as outside culture and society. They're concerned about what media do to audiences, groups, societies, as a kind of independent variable, or the other way around, from the active audience perspective, what audiences can do or not do with media. In a sense, also placing the media outside as some kind of optional thing you can use or not use at your choosing. The argument of mediatization theory is that the media has become so present in our social environment that they, in a sense, have become invisible. They are structuring the way in which we interact with each other. And therefore, you might say, if the notion of effect is a useful term, the most important effect of the media is their integration into the cultural and social texture of our lives. Because thereby they come to condition but not determine the way we interact with each other, the way we form a relationship with each other, and so forth. Furthermore, you could say that mediatization is also a kind of challenge to the field or discipline of media and communication studies, because it's about media in many different contexts, in many other contexts. It's about the way in which media may or may not influence political systems, how they interact with, in how they come to be useful or not useful in educational context, in other kinds of in family environments and so forth. So they're about how media are important or not important outside the media themselves. So it's a kind of interest in the media, but not for the sake of the media themselves. It's what they, in a sense, are implicating or influencing in other social environments. Now, I'm still on the same page. Just a little bit about mediatization in relation to existing media and communication research. I think it's useful to make a distinction between mediation on the one side and mediatization on the other side. Mediation is about the media's role in communication practices situated in time and space. So when we study mediation, we are studying the way in which we use various forms of media for communicative action within a particular context. And for obvious reason, that's what media and communication studies have been studying for mostly. Here, the term mediatization actually implies a different object of study. It's about the role of media in cultural and social transformations. And therefore, it has a different temporal and structural perspective, you could say. So, it's not that it don't want to acknowledge the importance of media in communication practices, but the very object of study is of another kind. They have two dimensions, you could say. There's a diachronic dimension, which relates to what you might label the historical transformation of media, society, cultural relationships. An early example of that, not using the label of mediatization, would be Jürgen Habermas's study of the structural transformation of the public sphere. The way in which various institutions, society, gradually shifted constellations and influences with each other, and thereby a new condition for politics and other institutions appeared. Furthermore, there's also a synchronic dimension to mediatization studies, and that is about the transformed conditions for social interaction in contemporary culture and society, including the way we use media in order to interact with each other. So there's both a temporal, historical dimension to it, and there's a synchronic, contemporary dimension to it, you could say, which is about this conditioning. A little bit more about this distinction between mediation and mediatization. I always say that we need to keep these concepts apart from one another and not confuse them. Because mediation is about using media for communicative practices. Mediatization is about structural changing, conditioning, interaction. Having said that, though, there is still a kind of inner relationship between the two. It's not that in real life they are completely separate, but as analytical concept, we should, in a sense, strive to keep them apart. But in actual practices, of course, they interrelate. Not least in the sense that due to this process of mediatization, structural changes take place that create new conditions for mediations. So increasingly when, for instance, office work environments are filled with various forms of computer technology, various forms of internet connections and so forth, we have a kind of reciprocal relationship between mediation and mediatization. On the one side, you could say that the accumulated presence of various forms of media and the general sort of gradual taking over, getting used to various forms of media and social interaction creates in itself a mediatization process. That is, the accumulated change of communicative behavior is in itself a kind of influence on mediatization or creating mediatization. At the same time as this sort of general overall structural process comes to conditions, other ways of interaction in the office space, for instance. Now, still it's important to understand that the process of mediatization, as I see it, is in a sense not caused by the media per se. Of course, without the media, there would be no mediatization process. That's, of course, true. But it's not, we should not understand it in a mechanistic way, in the sense that the mere spread of various forms of media technology creates social and cultural change. To some extent, that may be true in some cases, but what is important to understand is that mediatization occurs, this cultural and social change occurs because media come to be considered relevant in still more social and cultural environments. So in the office space, in the teaching institution, in the family, media increasingly appear relevant. And of course, different media in the various contexts appear relevant for the practices within that domain. And that perceived relevance is, in a sense, the cultural and social motor for change, taking these media in and changing practices because it appears to be that you, in a sense, can do other things that you couldn't do beforehand with these new media. So, if I should boil it down to a kind of definition, then what should we understand by mediatization? And I've been sort of advocating what I label an institutional perspective on mediatization, and that's of course because I have a kind of inherent sociological inclination. So I like institutions, not to be confused with organizations, but social institutions as domains of social practices like the family, like educational institution. Think of the church as an institution as well. So I tend to think about mediatization as something that takes place in and by these institutional domains. So we could think of mediatization as a process through which core elements of a social and cultural institution, for instance politics, religion, but also practices as language, become dependent on the media. And as a consequence, the practices are to a greater or lesser degree performed through interaction with the medium. And the symbolic content and the structure of the social and cultural practices are influenced by the modus operandi of the media, or what I often label the logics of the media. So, media come to co-structure interaction and agency within particular institutions. And they become a kind of interface between institutions and constitute an arena for society's shared experience and reflexivity. And then there's this issue about logics. This has been a very contested issue, whether or not one could talk about logics in relation to media and social institutions. But generally, I would say that when I talk about the logics of the media, I understand it as a kind of shorthand for labeling the media's organizational, technological, and aesthetic function, including the ways in which media allocate resources and act through formal and informal rules. I'll specify that a little bit more. But before I do that, I'll just say a little bit more to make it a bit more sort of perhaps vivid what is actually going on here. I think it could be useful to think about mediatization as this social and cultural process as one that is simultaneously taking place out there in the big society and in here in the smaller context of civil life. So we could think about mediatization out there as the process in which media increasingly developed into at least a kind of semi-independent institution in society, in which we sort of recognize the media as a particular domain that has, to some extent, its own way of operating. Only to some extent, as I will specify here. But it is out there, and we recognize it because it facilitates a collective public sphere, a kind of resource we all have to use in order to orient ourselves in society. And all social actors, industries, politicians, educators, experts, and so forth, orient themselves towards this domain. And in order to get access to the resource that the media represent, they to some extent have to accommodate to that resource and the logics by which this resource is operating. But it may both be mass media, as on the left here. Those coming from my country would immediately recognize the building of the National Public Broadcaster, but you don't. But at least you would be familiar with the Google name down on the right, which is also a kind of major global resource for communicating, which we, in a sense, all would like to have some kind of access to and use of. But at the same time as the media are developing as this kind of domain out there in big society, they also become increasingly present in here, in the various sort of practices of everyday life. And often that goes on pretty unnoticed. At a very early stage, you might say the family got mediatized in the sense that a lot of cultural practices in the family were, if not centered around media use, were at least influenced by media use. And you could say some of the moral economy going around in many families are often implicating media use in one way or another. We may actually have some of our more enjoyable moments in the family together, watching a particular program, seeing a sports event or something like that. But we can also sort of have problems with the media. We can punish the children if they use too much computer game time and so forth. So it's a kind of the moral economy of what's good in the family, what's bad in the family, how we should be together or not together. And increasingly you can see that various forms of mobile media may actually interfere in the question about whether or not we are actually present in the family or we are, in a sense, elsewhere while we are at home. And parents may experience this phenomenon of distant work, that we are, in a sense, we are at home in the hub of the family, but I'm actually working, so get out of my room, and so forth. So there's these various forms of moral economies in here, the doing family dimension of mediatization, but also in doing school, doing politics, are in a sense influenced by the way media works in various ways. Here we have some pictures of in-here dimensions. As you can see, as I see it, the family as an institution was at a very early stage mediatized to some extent because not least radio and later television came to take a very central stage in the family. Now, we should of course also recognize that these various domains are mediatized to different degrees. The idea of mediatization theory is certainly not that the media are, in a sense, a kind of overwhelmingly external force that simply shapes every social domain in its picture. The idea is rather that the media come in and in various ways and to various degrees influence various institutions. So the outcome of mediatization of politics may be completely different, have different consequences than the mediatization of the family, for instance. And also the social and cultural context, the history of the culture in question, are important for understanding how the mediatization processes are spelled out. So this is not about a kind of uniforming of society. It's about the way in which various media get institutionalized and therefore come to structure the way in which we interact with each other. I promised to say a little bit more about logics of media and perhaps also in a wider sense logics of institutional domains. I'm sort of inspired very much by what's labeled structuration theory, initially proposed by Anthony Giddens, but also developed by others. And the idea here is to think about cultural and social domains as having various degrees of autonomy or separation, and due to that part semi-autonomy, they are operated in a sense by various forms of formal and informal rules. And they rely on particular resources, symbolic resources, authority, information, various forms of material resources, buildings, technology, and so forth. And so are the media. So we have to think about the way in which media work, and we want to analyze the way media work and talk about the logics of the media. We have to take into consideration the whole spectrum of symbolic and material resources. Symbolic resources are, for instance, very important for the way that social media work. The question about whether or not you have followers or not is, in a sense, a key issue in the workings of authority in that medium. But it's also a medium that works on very material aspects. It's a much commercialized business. So not least Facebook and Twitter are commercial enterprises that have built in various forms of technologies that operate on a kind of commercial logic that is, in a sense, paired with a peer network logic on its own. And increasingly, we could actually, if we want to follow on the automation trend there, say that increasingly you can see that this integration of media into society is also an integration of what you might call systemic logics coming from, for instance, commercial operation with civil life world logics. That is about the way in which we actually communicate, form relationships on a human regular basis. Furthermore, we can also, as for instance, Ulrike Klinger-Jakob-Svensson has developed, distinguish between various forms of logics in terms of mass media logics and network media logics. It may actually be much more complicated than they initially thought, but I think they have a good idea as a starting point to make these distinctions, that various forms of media may actually group together and be informed by at least similar forms of logics that are different from other media's way of operating. But still, we may recognize them as media logics in one way or another. In this, in relation to this, it may also perhaps be important on a more historical note to observe that actually talking about the media is a more recent phenomenon. If we go back 60, 70 years, people actually didn't talk about the media as such, as a kind of domain of its own, or a set of very different technologies, somehow with similarities together. Earlier on, if you go 100 years back, people would talk about distinct technologies serving particular purposes, like the telegraph, the phonograph and similar technologies, newspaper and so forth. But they were not thought to be a kind of whole that somehow had similarities within themselves. Furthermore, and I want to click this as well, it's also important to understand that when we talk about the logics of the media, we should not think about them as the logics that are, in a sense, only characteristics of the media themselves, a kind of inner logic of them. The way media operate are always implicated in considerations of other social domains. So let's take, for instance, broadcasting as a media, radio and television. As, for instance, Patty Scanlon has shown, the practice of broadcasting was not something that was given by the technology. It was something that had to be learned by audiences and producers together. To make good broadcasting, to make it work socially, was something to be learned. And in that process, broadcasters and their professional practices and ideas had to negotiate considerations of the family, what would work in the family, what would work in terms of commercials and the market, what would work in relation to religion, what would work in relation to the political system, and so forth. So the logics of the media are, in a sense, a kind of compromise between what you might call professional values of technicians, journalists, drama producers, and all the rest of the media people, and other considerations of institutions outside the media themselves. So far, so good. And time is running, but I have a second set which is coming now. So far, I've tried to sketch out sort of the general idea about what mediatization is. How should we understand this process? As a process of change, not least. But in this second part, I'll try to hopefully be a little bit more concrete about what are then the changing conditions of social interaction following from the presence of media. And here I've been together with some colleagues working on a typology to think about if we want to say something about the way in which media, and here media understood in a wide sense, condition social interaction, and in particular social interaction in conflictual situations, then how are we to think about that? The first talk this morning, the question about control, dominance, was mentioned as a prominent paradigm in media and communication research, and it certainly is. And in a sense, I'll, to some extent, continue on that path here, because when talking about conflicts, you are talking about a particular social situation in which the question about control is at stake, in which power is implicated, and in which all social actors have a heightened sense and interest in using the media for persuasion, for producing public legitimacy, for controlling information, keeping back information, and so forth. So under those circumstances, what are then the media's way of conditioning this? Here I draw, or we draw, on three metaphors of media suggested by Joshua Meyerowitz, the author of not least the book No Sense of Place, the role of electronic media. And his argument about these metaphors are that you can distinguish between media as conduits or channels. That is, you can think about media as something transporting content from one side to another. You can also think about media as languages, as particular ways of constructing meaning. For instance, film implies a particular way of film language in contrast to if you have social media or you have text messages. That's another way of expressions. And then you can think about the media as environments, as a kind of totality, structure, and network in which you actually operate. And each of these metaphors entail different perspectives on what media actually are. And Joshua Myers' argument is that much of the sort of conflicts and frustration within media and communication studies are, at least to some extent, can be sort of explained by people actually using different metaphors for understanding and analyzing media. So those who are within the conduits or channel metaphor, they would look at media from a different perspective than those who think about the media as languages. I very much prefer Joshua Myers' holistic ambition of being able to think about all the different dimensions of media, if not simultaneously, at least understanding them as complementary to one another. So it's not a question of one metaphor being better than the other. It's about one metaphor being better at explaining particular aspects of media compared to another. And if we use all of them, we may actually get a more holistic picture of the way media work. And in this relation, you could think about how media come to condition conflicts in various ways. And I prefer the notion condition because I'm often also following the argument about the control idea of communication, that when it comes to conflict, it may be from the point of view of the social actor that they use the media for trying to control the interaction. But looking at it as a researcher from the outside, I'm not convinced that the media as such imply any control of the interaction. They rather condition the way in which various actors may or may not use the media, and thereby think they can gain control of what they are looking at. So if we look at the metaphor, look at this from the point of view of the metaphor of media as conduits, we may emphasize that what is at stake here is that the media generally work as amplifiers. That is, that they can increase the volume, the speed, the reach, the level of involvement. They can sort of expand our whole, the way in which a conflict operate in terms of volume. They work as amplifiers. But as languages, we should more emphasize the dynamics that relates to framing and performance of agency. I'll come back to that. Furthermore, we should also consider media as environments, as some that in a sense co-structure power relationship and involve control over and access to media in various degrees. Let me try and specify this a little bit. If we look at media as conduits, and thereby look at the notion of media as amplifiers, it is of course obvious that they may do that. That is, in a sense, the reason why we use media. Sorry. I need to synchronize. But we may just perhaps add to this typology of volume, speech, reach, and level of involvement, that what is at stake here is that the media increasingly have become an important source of information and resource for communication. In some instances, actually, the most important source of information and resource for communication. And why it is also sort of identified by Jesper Strømbæk as a kind of precondition for mediatization as such. If we look to the event of Charlie Hebdo and the terrorist attack on this magazine, we saw clear signs of amplification here. It was not least with the help of an almost instant news media coverage, but also coverage on social media, and coverage that got global, that this, within a few days, this attack resulted in the biggest demonstration in France history. And since France, in a sense, is the mother of revolution. It is something to have the biggest demonstration in France within a few days after this attack. So, several millions of people demonstrated in protest against these terrorist attacks. I'll come back to who it actually was, among others, but it was, at least from this amplifying perspective, many. But it was also a conflict that got amplified globally. So it, within very few days, created, in a sense, counter-demonstrations from people who wanted to frame this issue differently than it was done in Europe. For instance, here you can see a demonstration in the Philippines saying, "You are Charlie, respect Islam." And therefore trying to change the kind of the framing of the story. But basically, you could say what the media did here was to condition a conflict that somehow was uncontrollable, or at least unpredictable, because it allowed many more people to get access to the conflict itself. If we then move to the question about language, two important aspects are important here, namely framing and performative agency. Media frame issues in particular ways, or rather humans using media frame things in particular ways. And the question about framing increasingly become important for the way in which we actually come to engage in conflicts, and how we may actually be able to resolve conflicts in various ways. Framing is, as Edmund has learned us, about selecting some aspects of a perceived reality and make them more salient in a communicating context. Text in such a way as to promote a particular problem definition, causal interpretation, moral evaluation, and/or treatment recommendation. So framing is a very important aspect of the way in which media work, and therefore every actor has to consider how they frame events, how they frame their own position in times of conflict. But media are not only sort of vehicles for representation. Media are also, in a sense, stages upon which you can act or interact. And therefore, we should also consider the role of performative agency, both on the part of the media themselves, for instance, news media, but also as a stage upon which social action can act and interplay. And as Simon Cottle has said, unlike, say, media ritual, the adjectival mediatized helps to signal the performative agency of media in staging, enacting, and propelling certain event processes forward. And this was clearly also what we saw in the case of Charlie Hebdo, that framing and performative agency was very much important. If you look just at the front pages of newspapers in Europe after the day, and there was a lot of sort of material circulating on the internet that actually showed how various newspapers had framed these attacks. What you could see was that the news media were not just reporting on these events, they were also, in a sense, they were also taking side, and they were, in a sense, using their media as instruments of sympathy. So if you take, for instance, here on the left side, two Danish newspapers, they put all the ordinary news aside and just made one graphic illustration to express their solidarity with Charlie Hebdo. A very significant way of using a front page, and a very prominent one, but clearly one that in which framing was extremely important. And so, of course, did the journal Charlie Hebdo also, in a satirical way. But apart from the framing, it's also interesting to see in this case that the media were also on a stage upon which various social actors sort of acted. And for instance, some of the perpetrators called a radio station during the conflict and wanted to give their say on the story while they were followed by the police. So there were various ways in which the media were not only actors in the conflict, framing the conflict in particular ways, they were also a stage upon which actors sort of performed their various framing of the story. Certainly, the role of environments, media as environments, that is, they co-structure relationships of power and access and control of media. This goes for both various forms of social media that in themselves has various ways of organizing relationships between those who have many followers, less followers, in which you can have various forms of network relationships. You can have what is, for instance, called polarized crowds, which is often seen when we have contested political issues, in which you actually get a formation of communication in which you actually do not speak to each other across opinions, but rather have echo chambers of opinion formation besides each other. But also, of course, the media are not in control of everything. On the contrary, other institutions actually try to control the media in various ways, and try, for instance, the state try to control access to various forms of information, and then we have counter leaks of information by civil activists and so forth. So, more generally, you could say, looking at it from a network perspective, following Manuel Castells, that essential characteristics of the network society is that both the dynamics of domination and the resistance to domination rely on network formation and network strategies of offense and defense, either by forming separate networks or reforming existing networks. Another complicated quote, but the general idea is, in a sense, that control over and access to media as nodal points in social networks become important for the development and resolution of conflict. And more specifically or concretely, you would say that the question about control over information is also seen in the relationship between journalists and sources, about in the way media and audience users engage, and also, as for instance, as Nick Colby has suggested, that we can talk about the media capital of individuals and organizations. That is the way in which they are actually able to deploy resources and resources for using the media for social influence. And also in the case of Charlie Hebdo, you could see these relationships of power at work very prominently. Clearly, if you saw what we could call the traditional news media press, it was dominated by a particular political elite. They were, in a sense, to some extent, able to frame the response to the terrorist attack in particular ways. And it was also their presence on the streets in Paris and other French cities that came to dominate the coverage of those demonstrations. So it was also because the political system tried to sort of project their power in this particular situation that these demonstrations became so strong and got such a big media coverage. So if you had a different perspective, you really couldn't get it through the traditional news media at this point in time. You had to go on social media, like for instance one Twitter message down here on your right, where one says, "No idea why when terrorist attack starts they blame Muslims, please stop." So an alternative version had predominantly to come out through a different medium. And furthermore, you could see in this case that there was a kind of power struggle going on between the French government on the one side and the various French media on the other side about controlling the way in which you should report on these issues. So, for instance, after the event, the attack itself, the French state tried to sort of regain control of various French media, saying that they should not elicit information in the way they had actually did. done during the media conflict. So, at the very end, my argument is here that if we want to talk about dynamics of mediatized conflict, there are various ways in which media come to influence conflicts. But they do not determine conflicts. It's not as if television or social media make one result necessarily more obvious than another. If we should talk about determination, we could, if that makes sense at all, I'm not sure about that, we should perhaps more talk, as Stuart Hall once talked about, determination in the first instance. That is, that they, in a sense, condition, set up a kind of structure within you can interact, but what comes out of it can go in any direction, so to speak, or at least is dependent on many more cultural and social factors than the media themselves. But you can think about these conditions as following the media as conduits, language, and environments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So if you have, and I'm sure you do, questions, please.
Thank you very much for such an interesting journey. I would say this is. You spoke about earlier theories. I really liked when you said how mediatization is an attempt to theorize between powerful media facts and active audiences. I was wondering how you felt about Douglas Kellner's 3 pillars of cultural studies, because it's a very similar account to what you were describing in the sense that it revolves around political economy, text, and audiences. So my question, essentially, and I would like to use the example of the recent Bernie Sanders campaign, how Google proclaimed Hillary winner without anything being changed. It's just that Google somehow just occupied the space, because there's a lot about content writing. It's the news, the relationship between what's news and what's content writing really occupying this space. So my question is, in this view, which I see is a very, very idealistic one, how do you see the issues of political economy? I mean, you're speaking how you don't agree that media determined, but there is something there when, for instance, if you've been following the Democratic debate and campaign, how the media were really pro-Hillary and not at all. They were actually denigrating Bernie, even New York Times, some reputable. So how do you see the issue of control, being positioned within your mediatization theory?
I certainly think that the political economy approach certainly have a valid point about the way in which various forms of political, economic interests and structures interact with the media. And the media are, in a sense, embedded in those structures. And I would, in a sense, within this framework, think of this as the media as part, both in itself constituting an environment, but it is also in itself constituted by an environment. So there's a kind of reciprocity to that. I don't see, in that sense, any kind of conflict between a political economy approach and the mediatization approach. I mean, it's more. I mean, political economy is a more specific theory about the way in which various aspects of politics and economics work with the media, in particular in relation to political issues. This is, in a sense, a broader framework, a sociological framework that addresses many other aspects. Sometimes I get the feeling that perhaps those coming from the political economy side tend to overemphasize a kind of at least somewhat predetermined outcome, that somehow those in power always win because they, in a sense, control the environment. And that is actually also true in many cases. I'm certainly not objecting that. But I see some problems in that. I would have a more open space for actually having conflicts to be more volatile, more fluid in some instances. And I would say, if just to finish this answer, that when you point to the issue about making Clinton sort of the nominated persons, I mean, this was, of course, the media there functioned as a kind of echo chamber for that, and in that sense established it as a fact. But it was certainly also a very deliberate political attempt from Clinton's staff to push that and use the media, and therefore, I mean, she in a sense used her existing advantage in established media to get to that point, I would say.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Well, I will refer on one data you have emphasized. It's about the six corporations own more than 90% of all the media in the world. So it also corresponds with the fact that in this year, 2060, by some measurements of the research institutes, that we have reached a point where 1% of all population owns more than 50% of all goods and all wealth in the world. So the percentage of the poverty in the entire world, the global percentage, is increasing in last 20 years, and all struggles of the United Nations and the similar agencies are at the opposite way. Yeah. But we are going even deeper and deeper and deeper. I believe these data are corresponding to each other, that the less and less populations owns more and more of everything, of the wealth, of the financial resources, of the media resources as well, and all the capital, not just the material capital, but the intellectual capital as well. What do you think? Is there a solution for this problem and the way out from this paradigm?
Oh, that was a big question. I certainly well, of course, I mean, a lot of these depressing developments in terms of growing inequality has due to more general politics and economic developments, and not necessarily derives from the media. But if we want to talk about it, if we could create media that, in a sense, work more just, in the sense that they are, to a greater extent, taking into account what really concerns the whole population, also various forms of minorities and so forth. I think one of the key issues is to develop publicly responsible media systems. Not only individual media that are publicly responsible, but simply developing public responsible media systems that are, in a sense, accountable in various ways. And there's obviously no easy way to get around to that. But I think you can't really, in my opinion, unless you have some kind of political system, not controlling the media, but overseeing the way the media work, then you can't really be sure that you have a kind of a functional public sphere and a kind of media system that allow people to actually express themselves intellectually, culturally, and in other ways. So I think that's a key issue. But the question is, of course, that the balance between a political system, in some way overseeing a media system, and at the same time keeping a kind of arm's length distance to the media system, so they don't get subservient to the powers of the state. So that, I mean, it's a question about creating the right balance and autonomy for media in relation to financial, commercial interests and state on the other side. I mean, that's a very abstract answer. You have to deal with that in your particular national context in various ways. Yeah.
Anyone else?
Thank you. It was very interesting. I have many questions, but I'll ask number one. What changes in the media and mediatization will happen in the next 5, 10, 15 years? Can you about using mobile phones, television, internet, some sort of
That's difficult. I think what I see as a development, I'm a sociologist. I'm not although I'm interested in technologies, I'm not an expert on technologies. As far as I can see, one of the things that's developing now, or I mean, it's been talked about for a long time, but that's what you might call what's called augmented reality or the Internet of Things. That is, increasingly you can have technologies that have kind of a built-in communicative and kind of intelligence on its own. And increasingly, I think we will experience that our social environment will be sort of increasingly inhabited by various technologies in which you can see that the media, that is the communicative part of the technology, is only one part of the technology. So you will see that communication and technology will merge with other forms of technology that serves other purposes than communication as such. And I think that will sort of also entail some new questions about how we regulate the media to serve purposes, because clearly there are strong commercial but also strong state political interests in these dual technologies in terms of for state, in terms of surveillance, but also for commercial surveillance, predicting consumer behavior and other stuff. So I think that's a new aspect to it, that increasingly we have communication technologies that are converging, integrating, becoming these kind of common platforms with which you can do everything. You can do everything with a mobile phone, almost communicatively speaking. But increasingly we can do many other things than communicate with these technologies, but they will in a sense be merged within the same technology, or at least integrated in various ways. Yeah. If I should look into that. Yeah, the future.
I just want to ask you,
Yeah.
you would be so kind to clarify a bit how you're using performative agency. I mean,
Sorry?
Performative, yeah.
Hello. So thank you for a great talk. And I just wanted to ask you if you would be kind to clarify performative agency and what is the way that you use them performative. I mean, what is theoretical background?
What is my...
What is there a theoretical background to the performative? Because it's a very contested term, so I'm just wondering.
Yeah, well, again, I'm sort of a stubborn sociologist. I would in a sense derive it more from the, well, in a sense from Goffman's microsociology, in terms of he talking about symbolic interaction and the performative dimensions of those aspects. So that's, in a sense, if you want to say, what kind of background is it developed from? The idea here is, otherwise you could say that, I mean, I talk about framing as one aspect, and then about performative agency as another aspect. And I think framing is talking about media communication as representation. You can frame that representation in various ways. Performative agency is in a sense the pragmatic aspect of the media, that you actually do things. In a sense, you following Austin Searles and how to do things with words, you would say it's about how to do things with media. And I think I would derive that in I think that's the stuff that not least the government developed initially in sociology, but it's been taken over by various forms of, also in language studies, about symbolic interaction, linguistic interaction, conversational studies, and so forth. So, yeah.
I guess I was confused by who does things. I mean, media does it, or media makes us do it? When we talk about agency here, who?
Yeah, well, my argument would be both and. It's both in a sense that news media, as organizational entities, are framing issues, but they are also performing, as we saw, for instance, in the wake of Charlie Hebdo, they put a kind of solidarity front page up front. That's not only a framing, it's actually a performance that moves action further on. But it's not only organizations media organizations who act, or journalists as individuals, it's certainly also us as users who, meeting the frames of the news, try to make sense of the world with our framing of the events. But it's also our performance, both in mass media but also in social network media, how we interact with our peers, our followers, our groups, and so forth. So it's a both and.
Yeah, I just have another comment really to American politics, and this is the Donald Trump phenomenon that has occurred. That I think challenges us to rethink this issue of mediatization to such a great extent because of the whole history of how he came to the political scene. First as a reality TV star that creates a certain mediatized image of himself, and then enters the political process. In which this media-type personality is played up to the nth degree, in which there is a radical split between political agenda and media-type representation, on the one hand, in which he will be, obviously winning the Republican nomination and influences, the political process, the state relationships, coming from a corporate world that doesn't have such limitations as the state media. So, I try to think about the Trump phenomenon through the Baudrillard simulation and simulacra thing, but I don't know, what is your take on that?
Yeah, well, you could say that in American politics is really somewhat different from various forms of European politics, but I think in one way you could say that Trump is an extreme example of mediatized politics. Also because in a sense his rise is both a product of and a resulting factor in the Republican Party's meltdown. In a sense, his venue into politics is to some extent based on the fact that the Republicans are in despair, also due to the other developments or any answer. So if you think about politics and media as a kind of a institutional conflict, clearly in his case, well, media and money is triumphing over politics, as I see it. Whereas if you go to the Democratic Party, of course, both contestants there, Senator Clinton, they're very much, I mean, they're media savvy persons and great communicators, both of them. Clearly, you get the sense that, well, not least, I think in Bernie Sanders' case, that politics is in control. That this is about a political movement. This is not a media movement. But he uses media for political ends. So there's a great difference between those two, I would say. Yeah.
Is there anyone else? Okay, I'll ask a question. The professor here asked a very interesting question about the American elections, and at least for me, I really hope that Bernie Sanders will win the nomination, but that's not the case. This woman here also asked about the Google that actually imposed Hillary. So my question is, okay, everyone here, all of these people that connected here at this conference, we all know what the world is and what is happening. But I'm asking you for your personal opinion. Is there any hope for a revolution?
It's connected to my question as well.
That's a good question.
I wasn't so
The short answer will be yes. But I think that, I mean, clearly the way that suggested by another question earlier on, that the question about economic influence has clearly changed. That is, that simply the question about who owns what has changed tremendously during the last decades, and not least in the United States, but also in other countries of the world. I do, however, think that if we think globally, it's also important to understand that there is a kind of, there is a general incremental increase in income, in education, in enlightenment, if you look on a total scale. So there is, in that sense, we should not be overwhelmed by all the negative factors developing. There are certainly many issues to worry about, but I find, I mean, if you just take Bernie Sanders' movement, I actually made a promise to myself, which then doesn't become sort of obvious, that if Bernie Sanders ended up as United States president, I would be president in the United States at that moment, because that was so sensational that it was, in a sense, I would never have imagined that a person who, in a sense, was a declared socialist, or at least social democrat, would have stand any chance in America. But I think he has changed the Democratic Party, at least to some extent, in the United States. And I think that bears witness to the fact that also ordinary people, if they, in a sense, if they get together, if they work hard enough, if we get politicians who, in a sense, think of us as bigger than we, in a sense, are, there are hope for changing things. And I think if Hillary may be the next American president, but it may actually be that one of the younger people following Sanders may be the next president of the United States. And I think that will change something. So therefore, I think if the questions about hope, yes, I think it not only do I hope it is, but I think there is substantial evidence to suggest that it is actually possible to change the matter of things, also through views of the media.
I would also like to ask a sub-question.
Sorry, Nicole. But when we talk about Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders, they are politically totally opposite. But in terms of speaking that people got tired of the establishment, we can see that all over the world. We can see a harsh polarization of the left and the right. They both go totally extreme. So we have a tight political situation right now. Right here and right now, everywhere in the world. So I kind of noticed that following the established media, like ABC, NBC, CNBC, whatever, that won't do. There were some protests in Washington, you perhaps know, the Democracy Spring. No one reported about that. Only, I don't know, the Young Turks or some young people or non-established media, some independent media. So I think we have the internet right now, so we can do media by ourselves. We don't need some gatekeepers anymore. What do you think? Will there be any chance in perhaps near future, like 5 years or so, where the people will produce their own news and share it among them, and will it crash the media industry as we know it right now? Or will it change it somehow?
Well, again, I can perhaps provide a little, very, very partial answer to these big questions. As I see it, one of the major challenges is that currently both American and European politics is very much challenged by the rise of populist movements, in particular right-wing populist movements that attacks the very rationality of not only the European Union's order but also of national political orders. And these movements are actually very, very media savvy. They're very keen on using both social media, but also manipulating or in various ways influencing the sort of general news media. I don't think, at least thinking in the next 5-10 years, that it's feasible or likely that traditional mainstream news media will collapse. I think they will be around because there is a kind of importance to them that will make them stay one way or another. They will not be as significant in the future as they've been in the past, but I think they will stay. But as to the question about the sort of the civic agency through various forms of social media, I'm perhaps a bit more sort of skeptical about the potentials there. Landsberg and Segerberg wrote an excellent book called The Logic of Connected Action, which is about precisely the way in which the use of various social media are important for establishing new forms of political engagement. And they contrast what they call connective action with traditional forms of organized collective action. And I think that's a really good way of articulating this. However, as far as I can see, one of the problems with the new forms of social media mobilization through connected media is that that kind of mobilization is very hard to sustain over time. So many of the movements that have used social media to initially create big demonstration, create a kind of cultural new atmosphere about particular issues, they seem to fail in institutionalizing those ideas for change. And therefore, I think it's very important that we should not think about social media in contrast to mass media, connected media in contrast to collective media. We should rather think about the reciprocity, the interplay between these various forms of media and how they each have potential for projecting images, framing, for performative agency for various courses. And I think the problem is that many of right-wing populist movements at the time are very good at combining those two. Whereas what you might call the center-left movement is not very good at sort of sustaining both. Take, for instance, in the United States, the Tea Party movement. They were pretty good at using social medias for their purposes, but they were also very, very good at creating campaign networks of a more traditional organizational kind. So therefore, the combination of those two are the important thing. It's not saying that social media will revolutionize the world and the old world will go under. It's about combining those two, as far as I can see it. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Well, let's thank once again Professor Hjarvard for illuminating speech and even more illuminating answers, I will add. And we'll have a break now until 3, where we have sessions at the Banja Luka College of Communications. If there is anybody that needs, help with location or anything, we can help. And we'll all gather together tonight at 8 at Cafe Monet, which is, on the banks of the Barbas River. Well, thank you for your attention.